This week's episode of Fictional is brought to you by KiwiCo. KiwiCo creates super cool, hands-on projects for kids that make learning about science, technology, engineering, art, and math fun. Their mission is to provide the next generation of innovators with the tools and foundation they need to become creative problem solvers and critical thinkers. It's awesome. KiwiCo is offering Fictional listeners the chance to try them for free. To redeem this offer and learn more about their projects for kids, visit kiwico.com/fictional. That's KiwiCo. KIWICO.com/fictional. Real quickly, this is a continuation of the previous Count of Monte Cristo episodes from last season, episodes 3 through 5. I promise we are going to finish it this time, but if you haven't heard the previous episodes, you're probably going to want to listen to those first. I'm going to do a quick summary for anyone who hasn't heard those, so really, if you don't want them to be spoiled for you, please go listen to those and then come back. Previously on Fictional, Edmond Dantes found himself sent to prison for a crime he mostly didn't commit by 3 men, Danglars, Fernand Mondego, and Caderousse. Villefort, the attorney, shipped Edmond off to prison after learning the young man in question was going to implicate Villefort's own father, Nordier. Hours before his own wedding to Mercedes, Edmond was arrested, and a small bump in the road turned into a prison sentence where he lived for 13 years, sneaking underground to a priest's cell. That priest, a fellow prisoner, helped Edmond not only deduce who had sent him to prison, but also told him of a massive treasure hidden on the island of Monte Cristo. After the priest died and Edmond escaped, he found the treasure and learned that his enemies were among the richest, most powerful men in Paris. Every revolution has its catastrophes. Deal with it. That's what the king's attorney, Monsieur de Villefort, had told Bertuccio the day his brother had died. Bertuccio's brother had been pressed into service in the Emperor's army, the French army, after Napoleon returned from exile. Together, they had marched for France, and at the end of the 100 days, when defeat loomed, many had also died for France. After the return of the king, Bertuccio's brother had begged for what money Bertuccio had, so as to give it to his wife, while he himself fled the country. After some thought, Bertuccio resolved to deliver the money to his brother himself. He arrived in Nîmes, literally wading through blood. There had been a massacre, a purge. Anyone even suspected of supporting Napoleon's return had been hunted down, and people like Bertuccio's brother, wearing a uniform from Napoleon's army, they were killed on sight. Bertuccio had heard of French justice, but until that day, he'd never felt the need to avail himself of it. That day, when he humbled himself before the king's attorney, he couldn't believe the words he was hearing. Every revolution has its catastrophes. Villefort had been completely unsympathetic. Bertuccio had shouted that his brother had been murdered on the street. Villefort was the king's attorney. They needed to investigate. But Villefort only sighed. Unfortunately, Bertuccio's brother had fought for the wrong side. He had fought for the emperor. If the emperor had won, the streets would be choked by royalist blood. You see, it was a natural end to Napoleon's rebellion. Now get out. Instantly, Bertuccio had stood, spitting on Villefort's desk. Bertuccio was a Bonapartist, and he was declaring a vendetta against this man, Villefort, who all but said his brother's murder had been a good thing. The next time they met, Villefort would know his last hour had come. Before Villefort could recover, Bertuccio was gone. That exchange was 3 months ago, and now Bertuccio had him. He had tracked the man to Auteuil, just outside Paris. It was a house belonging to the Marquis de Saint-Méran, Villefort's father-in-law. Villefort knelt in the garden, alone, focused. Bertuccio gripped a knife and silently scaled the fence. As he neared, he realized Villefort was burying a large wooden box in the dirt. It was ornate. A treasure? All the better. Villefort had almost finished when he felt an arm wrap around his neck, and the other plunge a knife deep into his chest. Blood spattered on Bertuccio's face as he whispered into Villefort's ear, "I am Giovanni Bertuccio, thy death for my brothers, thy treasure for his widow. My vengeance is complete." Bertuccio ripped out the knife, and Villefort collapsed to his knees. The attacker quickly uncovered the box, kicked open the door to the street, and ran. Moments later, Bertuccio slowed by the river, gripping the box. There was no commotion, no one looking for him. Which wasn't surprising. Dead men couldn't raise alarms. He wiped his knife and then pried at the lock of the box that Villefort had been quickly burying. Seconds later, the lock popped, and the box sprung open. Bertuccio looked down at the contents. He couldn't believe his eyes. He set it down, looking back at the estate where he had just stabbed Villefort, covering his mouth with one hand. The baby, who had been turning blue inside the box, was now quickly regaining his color and starting to cry. Franz woke up on the floor of the grotto and started picking hay from his face. Wow. That was the last time he smoked hash with strangers in a cave. He chuckled. That probably wasn't true, but still, how did he get here? Franz had arrived in Rome a few days before his friend, Albert, and had some extra time before the Carnival. He decided to kill some time by killing goats, and the ship he had hired for the excursion told him of an excellent hunting place where he wouldn't have to pay, providing everyone could keep their mouths shut. It was little more than a rock full of grottos and goats and smugglers. Franz's ship had assured the smugglers that, they were cool. They had just come to shoot some goats. And, well, the smugglers believed them. There were portions of the beach Franz and his friends couldn't walk, but as soon as Franz announced that he was a baron, word came from the caves that the chief wanted to speak with the young man. Blindfolded, Franz felt his feet sinking into sand, then shuffling along stone walkways of the grottos. Before padding onto carpet, someone tore off the blindfold, and Franz stood looking on the most beautiful home he had ever seen, one seemingly cut straight from stone. That was saying something too, as he had seen some of the richest homes in Paris, and was a self-described dandy. What was even stranger than his elaborate surroundings, however, was what was right in front of him, or rather, who was right in front of him. The man was so pale that he almost glowed, and his sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to absorb everything around him. He wore a red fez with a single blue tassel, and as he took a bite of his roast pheasant, his white teeth flashed. He rang the bell once, and a servant appeared with a plate for Franz. Franz thanked the man, but he only nodded. Ali won't say much. He can't, the stranger across the table said. You see, Ali here, Ali had the misfortune of venturing too close to the harem of the king of Tunis. Because of the nature of his crime, his punishment was public. He was to have his tongue cut out on the first day, eyes gouged out on the second day, and head taken off on the third day. Oh wow, Franz managed between bites of one of the best meals he had ever tasted. It was really good luck for him that you caught him before the second day. Oh, you misunderstand. I didn't catch him before the second day. I waited until the second day. I had always wanted a mute servant. I paid a lot for him, and he's loyal. He owes me his life, after all. The stranger smiled. Where were his manners? He should introduce himself. His name was Sinbad the Sailor, and this was his home. Franz didn't remember a lot after that. Together they smoked cigars, and then a few other things, talking all the while. The rich man didn't have an accent, and he issued commands to his servants and smugglers in a dozen languages. The night disappeared in a haze of smoke, and Franz had woken up here, in a grotto on a bed of hay. He stumbled out to find his own servants asleep on the beach, with a message from the stranger whose real name absolutely was not Sinbad the Sailor. The stranger had left in the night. Urgent business was calling him north. He told Franz that he would seek the young man out the next time he was in Italy. One of the sailors brought Franz his gun, but Franz grimaced. What was this? Don't bring him his guns, bring him a torch. They were going to find the opening to the stranger's home. Franz and his men lost the better part of a day sifting through all the grottos they could find, but there was no trace of the house, not even a single footprint or any other sign of life. Franz shook his head. The stranger was all the more mysterious. Later that afternoon, he finally called it, announcing to his hired sailors that it was time to reboard their boat and head out. They'd wasted enough time here, and they had to get back to Rome to meet up with Albert de Morcerf, the son of the Count de Morcerf, a man who had bought his noble title, but who had been born as Fernand Mondego, poor Catalan fisherman, who had married the woman he had loved since he was a boy, Mercedes. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Wait, so you were kidnapped by a bandit? And bandits are still a thing? Lucian asked Albert, 3 months after his trip from Rome. Albert corrected him. He was technically kidnapped by a beautiful woman. Well, actually, he was kidnapped by a 15-year-old boy he was meeting up with. The table collectively cocked their heads. Albert explained that he thought the boy was a beautiful woman. It was a tactic that the bandit used, apparently. Their ringleader, Luigi Vampa, admitted that guys fell for it all the time. Albert continued, he'd been out at the Carnival, trying to make something happen, when suddenly, he did make something happen. 3 times a woman passed him, and then finally, she gave him the time and place to meet up. Of course he went to the rendezvous place, and the next thing he knew, he was in the catacombs of San Sebastian with a pistol to the back of his head. If it wasn't for the Count of Monte Cristo, his head would now be scattered around the catacombs. Albert explained that the bandits kidnapped rich foreigners for ransom, and they were surprisingly punctual. They'd sent Franz, Albert's traveling companion, a message, saying that if they didn't have the money by 6 a.m., Albert would be dead by 7. So you got them the money then? Someone asked. Albert shook his head. He didn't do anything. He actually took a nap, and only woke when Monte Cristo and Franz walked into his cell. The bandit told him that he was free to go because, get this, Monte Cristo was a friend of the bandit. Yeah. Apparently Monte Cristo had helped Vampa when Vampa was a boy, and when the boy became a man, and the man became a legend, he didn't forget a good turn. Vampa had promised to never harm Monte Cristo or his friends. And Albert, he guessed, must be one of Monte Cristo's friends. It was really fortunate that this enigmatic count just so happened to be staying above them at the hotel. And now the only thing this Monte Cristo guy wanted in return was just an introduction to Parisian high society, which Albert was going to give him. Today. But first, there were more introductions to be made. While he talked, 2 more men arrived. One was a baron and a diplomat, and the other, the man who had saved his life, Maximilian Morel. 13 years ago, Maximilian had seen the gun that his father was going to use to end his own life. He had just been a boy then, but he knew how serious the situation had become. Just before his father pulled the trigger, their merchant ship, the Pharaon, the one they all thought had sunk, came back over the horizon. It was a miracle, one that Mr. Morel would believe to his dying day was the result of some guy named Edmond Dantes, a captain of his who died in prison. To honor the priceless gift Edmond had given him, Maximilian had committed to saving a man's life, a stranger's life, every September 5th, on the anniversary of the day the mysterious benefactor had saved his father. On one occasion, he had saved the life of a baron while he ventured around the Arabian Peninsula, being chased through the desert by sword-wielding bandits. It kind of felt like it shouldn't count if you saved a man's life by killing several others, but it counted for the diplomat, and so, today, Maximilian was being introduced to Parisian high society as well. The gathered men fell into discussing this mystery man who was coming to breakfast. Franz had made the connection between Monte Cristo and the man he did drugs with on the actual island of Monte Cristo, who went by the name of Sinbad the Sailor. It wasn't a big leap to make. Franz had to stay back in Italy, but he warned Albert that this Monte Cristo guy was more than he appeared. Albert guffawed. Yeah, of course he was more than he appeared. That's why he was awesome. However, Franz had seen it, even though Albert had not. When Monte Cristo met Albert's outstretched hand for that final time, when he had been forced to touch the young man, he nearly imperceptibly winced. Seeing as this was based on a half-second of something he maybe saw, Franz didn't want to tell Albert that his new hero might just hate him. But now it was 10:30 in the house of Fernand Mondego, the Count de Morcerf, and the bell rang. A man stepped into the room and announced him. The Count of Monte Cristo had arrived. Monte Cristo strode into the room, greeted the young man, and took a seat at the breakfast table. He apologized for being seconds late. He had traversed 500 leagues in the past 24 hours, and his traveling carriage had now only arrived at Albert's front door. If it were legal to own or beat slaves in France, he would have done so many times over and been there early. First, he had to ask for excuses for any improprieties he was to make. He had traveled the world over, but he had never been to Paris before. The other men sat there, watching this mysterious man. He begged their pardon if there was anything in him too Turkish, too Italian, or too Arabian. Now, let's have breakfast. Albert was the first to say something. If he had been traveling for 24 hours straight, how did he eat? The Count laughed. He didn't. He slept. Monte Cristo produced a pill that he made himself. It sent the user immediately to sleep for as long as he needed, no matter how hungry he was. It was invaluable to him as he traveled. And certain people had found it valuable as well. He traded a pack to the Pope for the life of an innocent man, and a pack to a sultan for the liberty of a beautiful woman. As they ate, the men talked and laughed. They learned of the exploits of the Count of Monte Cristo, about whom Albert had not been exaggerating. Monte Cristo congratulated Albert on his recent betrothal to a woman by the name of Mademoiselle Eugenie Danglars, daughter of the Baron Danglars. He also learned about Maximilian and the bankers that had, for some reason, bought and forgiven his father's debt. It was the Bank of Thomson and French, but when they were contacted, they said they didn't know anything about it. Monte Cristo replied that they were actually the ones who secured his unlimited line of credit. He could chat with them. The young men at the table were speechless. Unlimited? As in, unlimited, Monte Cristo replied. His French was rusty. That's what the word meant, right? Anyway, his servants were putting the money to good use, getting him a mansion down the street and a vacation mansion on the outskirts of Paris, for when the first mansion became a bit too cramped. The men laughed. Money, mansions, all they had left to secure for him, it seemed, was a mistress. At that, the Count laughed too. He had something better than that. He had a slave. The room fell silent. The young men exchanged glances before Monte Cristo continued. He explained that these young men got their mistresses at the opera, but he purchased his in Constantinople. It had cost him more, but he was sure she wasn't going anywhere. The journalist spoke up, saying that that's actually really illegal. The moment she stepped on the French soil, she was free. That's the law. Monte Cristo shrugged. He took the final bite of his breakfast. Fine. Okay. She was free. No one spoke her language for hundreds of miles in any direction. Who was going to tell her? As the breakfast started to wind down, the men began seeing themselves out. Baron Danglars, a prominent banker, was giving a talk that morning. And even though it would be had that painting commissioned a few years ago, it was to be of anything his mother wanted. But she chose that scene. The painter loved it, Albert loved it, and his father hated it. He had flown into a rage the first time he laid eyes on it, and that's why it was now tucked away in Albert's private salon. The picture seemed to have some sort of malign influence, and Albert's mother never came into this room without looking at it. Always, when she did, she would weep. Monte Cristo studied the painting with more intensity than he had ever studied anything before. It was so close to the image he had had in his mind, the one that saved him from the darkest nights in Chateau d'If. Monte Cristo turned to address Albert, but he saw someone else standing in the doorway. It was that boy that he had found with Mercedes, the one that had scowled at Edmond Dantes, even though the sailor pretended not to notice. The boy who had been sitting at the table that day with Danglars and Carissa. The boy who had attended the wedding feast of Edmond Dantes and Mercedes. He was a man of 40 now, with a mustache and a title and a mansion, but he would always be that boy. No amount of externalities could hide what he truly was. The Count de Morcerf, the man who had been born a Catalan by the name of Fernand Mondego, entered the room. Albert smiled and explained that he had the honor of introducing the Count of Monte Cristo. Monte Cristo didn't move, forcing Mondego to walk toward him. The Count de Morcerf stood studying Monte Cristo's face for a half-second, and then grabbed his hand, thanking him for saving his son in Rome. They were in his debt, and it was an honor. Monte Cristo responded with a smile of his own, saying that the honor was his. After all, Albert's father's reputation preceded him. Monte Cristo gushed over Fernand's army record and his legacy, praised his prudence and his discretion, and said it was just so impressive what Mondego had done. Mondego smiled. He had served in the army, gained honors, but he hung up his sword a long time ago. His battlefield was now politics. Monte Cristo marveled at the man. Morcerf was a count. That was obvious. So he must have been born with the name and riches. I mean, how else could you get that much money? But to enlist as a soldier and work your way up, that's what was so great about France. That someone could do that and rise all over again, with their own name, as if they were born as nothing more than a humble fisherman. Albert could see his father's brow darkening and jumped in, saying that Monte Cristo was an anomaly here in France. Someone who despised all honors, save people's names. Monte Cristo shrugged. That's how they did it in Italy. A man grew according to his name, and nothing more. Mondego smiled. Well, Monte Cristo was welcome in France, where, better or worse, people could choose their own lives. Albert's father was about to invite Monte Cristo to the chamber to hear Baron Danglars talk, when he chanced to look at the door, and the smile faded from his face. Honey, are you all right? Monte Cristo turned. When he started on this path, he knew that this moment would come. He told himself he would be ready. But now, looking in those eyes, how could he have possibly been ready? The Countess de Morcerf, Mercedes, stood in the doorway. The instant Monte Cristo turned toward her, she nearly fell over. Albert rushed to catch his mother, and he quickly helped her back upright. Both he and his father asked her what was wrong, but Mercedes couldn't speak. Monte Cristo was the same way. It was now over 20 years on, but she was just as beautiful as he remembered her the last time he had seen her, on their wedding day. Mercedes was the first to recover. She was just overcome, she said. Seeing the man who had saved their son's life, she was just so grateful. She wanted to thank Monte Cristo from the bottom of her heart. A smile spread across Monte Cristo's face. There was nothing to thank. He simply did the right thing. Mercedes said even so, it was wonderful to see him here, a friend to her son and her family, and she thanked God that it was such. Monte Cristo managed to smile and a nod, but said nothing in return. Later, as Monte Cristo rode to his house, looking out the window of his carriage, he wondered, how much had she known when she married him? Did she know that Mondego had sent him to prison for 13 years for her hand? Did she know that he and Danglars had essentially killed his father? And Albert's salon? Did she know? Did she know it was him? She seemed like she knew, but the thought lingered in Edmund's mind that the woman he had loved, the face that had helped him through the darkest nights in Chateau d'If, might not even remember his face, that he had been nothing more to her than the love of her youth that she forgot about soon after he disappeared. If so, that was even more of a reason to do what he had planned. If she, too, had forgotten him, then these men had truly taken everything. Monte Cristo had left the Countess de Morcerf and Viscount Albert while the Countess had been studying his face as intently as he had studied that painting. They begged him to stay, but he said he still needed to visit the house he had just bought. But don't worry, they would be seeing more of him. He would be staying in Paris for a year, and he would be just down the street. He left Mercedes looking as if she had so much more to say, and he entered his carriage. Now, as he was pulling up to his new house, he told the driver to pause a moment. He pulled out a notebook from inside his coat and unlocked it with a key kept around his neck, jotted a few things down, and then tucked it away. It was time to pick up Bertuccio. Monte Cristo trusted his servants. In fact, one of his most trusted staff, Ali, had even bought and stocked the new house on the most fashionable street in Paris, a job the men at Albert's party couldn't believe Monte Cristo left completely to him. But Monte Cristo trusted Ali's discretion completely. That was not the case with all of his servants, however. One of them was hiding something. Bertuccio was a man who had been recommended to Monte Cristo for his staff by a priest, known as Busoni. Yes, this priest was the very same man who had dispersed the massive inheritance of Edmond Dantes to his last surviving friend in earlier episodes, a tavern owner by the name of Gaspard Caruso. Years ago, Busoni had been called in to meet Bertuccio at a local prison. The pair had met because Bertuccio had been accused of a stabbing. Now, Bertuccio sat across from his employer, Monte Cristo, bouncing in the carriage and growing more and more agitated the further they drove from the center of town. Edmond had known part of the story. He'd heard it while in disguise as Busoni, the Italian priest who gifted the diamond to Caruso, one of the accomplices to the arrest of Edmond Dantes. To an honorable man, a massive influx of wealth was a good thing, but Caruso was not an honorable man. To someone like him, it was as though Edmond had pulled the pin on a hand grenade and walked away. That very evening, Caruso had ridden away from his house, only to return with an invited jeweler to come inspect the diamond. The expert made an offer on the spot in cash, and Caruso had taken it, offering the man a bed for the night. When the morning came, Caruso's wife lay dead on top of the jeweler's corpse. The bullet meant for Caruso had misfired while the couple stabbed the jeweler. Of course, Bertuccio hadn't known any of this as he huddled outside the couple's home. Caruso, being the upstanding man he was, let smugglers hide out inside his shed. Bertuccio's ship was boarded that morning, and he swam up the canal to Caruso's place where, behind a false wall in the back of the tavern, he'd heard the scuffle. He'd investigated, of course, just in time for the town sentries to see a known smuggler standing over the bodies of two people. Luckily, Bertuccio remembered hearing Caruso and his wife talking about a Busoni character through the false wall, and 3 months in jail later, Busoni did, in fact, corroborate the story of the diamond after hearing Bertuccio's confession. Mere days after Busoni's arrival, Caruso had been found and confessed to everything. Authorities set Bertuccio free, but the old priest warned him that the life of a smuggler would kill him. If, he wanted safer work. The Count of Monte Cristo happened to be looking for a new steward. And so, 6 months and one horrifying family tragedy later, Bertuccio entered Monte Cristo's employ. That's how, years later, he now rode in a carriage with Monte Cristo up to the house where he had once stabbed Monsieur de Villefort and rescued a child. Monte Cristo watched his servant's face as they strode inside. Color drained from his cheeks as he grew increasingly sweaty and agitated, until at last they came to the garden and stood on the spot. Years and years earlier, Bertuccio plunged a knife into Villefort's chest. Bertuccio's hands turned white, and he gritted his teeth until he cried out. He couldn't take it anymore. Monte Cristo was standing on it, the exact place where Villefort fell. Monte Cristo narrowed his eyes. What in the world was this guy's deal? Sitting down on a stone bench, Monte Cristo told Bertuccio that he didn't care what the servant had done, but he did care that he had secrets. Secrets that made him too scared to walk through the garden at nightfall. Bertuccio could either keep his secrets or keep his employment. That was his choice. Reluctantly, Bertuccio shared what he had only told one priest, and then only in pieces, of how he had stabbed Villefort and rescued the suffocating child. He dropped the boy off at an orphanage, leaving a scrap of his cloak in the event that he ever needed to return for the baby. After that, he went home, telling his brother's widow that Benedetto, his brother, had been avenged. Villefort was dead. From that point on, it was easy to get back to smuggling. After banishing Napoleon for a second time, the royal government found it difficult to just exist, let alone enforce any laws on the sea. Life was easy and the money was good. So good that, one morning, Bertuccio returned to find a surprise. Benedetto. Not his brother, but the baby that had been named after his brother. His sister-in-law had returned to Paris and adopted the boy that Bertuccio had left. Living with her brother-in-law smuggler she wasn't really romantically into at all, and raising the child of the guy he had murdered, well, It wasn't the family she envisioned when she first married Benedetto, but it was a family. And for a while, they were happy. Then, Benedetto started growing up. The first time it happened, they told themselves it was just a boyhood curiosity. He didn't know his strength, or what he was doing to the kitten. The most shocking thing wasn't what he did to the creature, but that he wasn't shocked. Then, they started finding more instances, and the boy's behavior became more and more cruel. So cruel that the other parents wouldn't let their kids play with Benedetto anymore. And so, the boy found a crowd that better suited his appetites. One day, Bertuccio returned to find his sister-in-law had a black eye and a reticence to talk about it. Eventually, she revealed that she had held out against Benedetto, but the boy, the young man, was getting more and more forceful. He had threatened to come back with his friends, but now he'd been gone for days. Bertuccio located Benedetto on the edge of town and collared the young man. His face spread a look of terror for a half second, and then he relaxed into a laugh at the sight of his adoptive father's clenched fist. He couldn't do it. He never had, and he never would. You know why? Bertuccio wasn't even his real father. Unable to say a word, Bertuccio let the boy go. He always told himself that if Bertuccio was his son, he wouldn't let the boy get away with any of this. But every time he rose a hand against Benedetto, he thought of Villefort. It wasn't the boy's fault he was terrible. He was the son of an evil man. A man Bertuccio had killed. So what right did Bertuccio have to punish anyone? Bertuccio gripped the grinning form of Benedetto close, and, through gritted teeth, said that he had a job coming up. But when he returned, Benedetto would come with him. He would live a life on deck, and Benedetto would learn discipline. His son laughed again. When he returned to his friends, they would all laugh at Bertuccio, as the man made his way home to tend to someone else's wife. That trip, of course, was the one where the law finally caught up with Bertuccio, and he dove from the side of his boat toward Catarossa's tavern, ending up in the bedroom with the bodies, and in jail for 6 months until Catarossa was caught. And then, after he was released from prison, Bertuccio immediately returned home to nothing. According to neighbors, Bertuccio's sister-in-law had died screaming. She had stood firm against Benedetto and his friends, thinking that Bertuccio was only a few days out, and that he would press the monster into service with one of his friends, and then the nightmare would be over. But Bertuccio didn't return. Only Benedetto. One night, he and 6 of his friends arrived at the small house. Benedetto told his friends he would start looking. They should get her talking, in case Bertuccio had hidden the money too well. He didn't, however, and it was about the time the boys started in with the candles that Benedetto found the lockbox. He walked over to his adoptive mother, who his friends were holding down, thanked her for everything she had done for him, and dropped a lit candle on her nightclothes. By the time the boys let go, it had consumed her nightgown and spread to the chair. Without so much as a backward glance, Benedetto casually walked out, barred the door behind him, and left town forever. In the dark, Bertuccio had stood before his burned house. He had no family, no son, and no ships. Young Benedetto had taken all the money he had in the world, and the only person that really mattered to him. He sighed and looked down at the address in his hands. He might as well go pay this Count of Monte Cristo a visit. You were merciful, Monte Cristo reflected after a long period of silence. I tried to be, Bertuccio replied. That wasn't a compliment. Monte Cristo stood to look at the exact spot where Villefort had fallen. Bertuccio had saved the child of his enemy. When you kill a viper, its brood must go with it. These people barely deserve to be called that much. Their children were simply more of them. And somehow, Benedetto had managed to be even worse than his father. It wasn't Bertuccio's fault. He couldn't help but save the child. He was a good man. But Bertuccio didn't realize that they didn't play by any rules but their own. And then only when it suited them. He looked his servants square in the face. To call them animals would be too nice. Even animals care about their own. No, Bertuccio had been too kind and too scared. Kind because he saved Benedetto, and scared because he hadn't seen his vendetta through. Villefort lived. Now get up. Bertuccio would remain in his employ, but the time had come for them to leave this garden. There was too much to do to wallow in the past. Monte Cristo had done enough of that for both of them. Now, it was time for action. And by action, of course, Monte Cristo meant doing nothing and chuckling at the Baron Danglars the next morning. As the man tried to get in to speak with the mysterious count, who had been recommended to his bank by Thompson and French, Bertuccio blocked the door, saying that His Excellency only saw visitors on appointment. Danglars rolled his eyes. Okay, Excellency, very nice. He was some count with a purchase title from Italy, not royalty. When was he available? But Bertuccio wasn't listening to Danglars, just the man whispering in his ear. Bertuccio nodded and looked at the horses. He informed Danglars that His Excellency thought the horses Baron Danglars drove were beautiful. How much? Danglars looked back at the horses, and then again at the door and laughed. They weren't for sale. They were a birthday present to his wife. They were one of a kind and felt like they cost as much as a province. No, he wouldn't part with them. Bertuccio replied that he had been authorized to offer the Baron double. At this, Danglars furrowed his brow. Double what? He hadn't even said how much he paid for them. Bertuccio shrugged. It didn't matter. The Baron simply had to name his price. And that was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to Baron Danglars. Unlimited is, well, it's not a word we use with credit, Baron Danglars said to the Count of Monte Cristo later on that day, after the Count dropped in on him and received an immediate audience. Of them all, Edmond had been worried about Danglars the most. He had been Danglars' shipmate on the Farron. He had spent years with the man. That's why all this pomp was necessary. Danglars couldn't see past the dollar signs in his eyes, or I guess the franc signs. The Baron explained that thousands and millions, yes, those were words they used in finance, but unlimited? Monte Cristo sighed. What exactly was everyone's confusion with this word? Could the house of Baron Danglars accommodate him or not? Danglars replied that he could accommodate any need anyone had. He just wanted to know what that need was first. Monte Cristo groaned and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Okay, now they were talking in circles. He needed unlimited credit. Danglars laughed. He needed a number. If Monte Cristo needed, say, 1 million, Monte Cristo interrupted him with a hand, opening up his own pocketbook. If he needed just 1 million, he wouldn't have bothered with a line of credit. He dropped 2 banknotes on the table, totaling over 1 million. For once in his life, Baron Danglars had no words. But Monte Cristo did. If the house of Danglars couldn't meet his needs, he would go to another house that could. He had 4 more of these. He spread out the letters of introduction from Thompson and French, his bank in Rome. 4 letters, 4 requests for unlimited credit from the best houses in Paris. Danglars couldn't offer any comeback here. One of these was unprecedented. But 5? He begged Monte Cristo's forgiveness. When he said he needed a number, he only needed to know how much Monte Cristo needed today. He would be happy to have Monte Cristo as a client. The Count smiled. He was glad they could clear up the confusion. 6 million francs should be fine, but he reserved the right to come back for more whenever it was needed. Danglars nodded. Of course, of course. You did what? Madame Danglars screamed. Monte Cristo and Lucien Debray took that as their cue to exit. Danglars had wanted to introduce Monte Cristo to his wife, but first he had to obtain permission to go to that wing of the house, wait awkwardly with Monte Cristo while he got it, and then see his wife and her very special platonic friend, the young and dashing Lucien Debray, leaving her room. Obviously nothing to see there. It was then that he introduced Monte Cristo and told his wife that this was the man that had bought her horses for double what they were worth. She yelled that she had already promised Madame de Villefort that she could drive the dappled grays tomorrow, but they had been sold. How would that make them look? Like they needed the money? Did they need the money, Baron? Both Lucien and Monte Cristo left before the Baron launched into mansplaining investments to her. It wasn't until 2 hours later that Madame Danglars received a note with the dappled grays. Monte Cristo was returning them. He couldn't stand the thought of a home in turmoil because of him. He complimented her on her taste and said that he looked forward to seeing them all when he was more settled. The Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes himself, sat on the porch overlooking the street as Bertuccio returned from giving the horses back. Fernand Mondego and Danglars were now both indebted to him, without suspecting that he was the man they had sent away a lifetime ago. It was time for Villefort. Edmond grinned. His time with the horses had been enough, and Ali had been practicing with the lasso all afternoon. The Villefort women would be riding by tomorrow morning. It was time for Phase 2. That's where we're going to leave it this week. As a reminder, we are going to finish Monte Cristo this season, at last, so stick around for the next couple of episodes. Also, for some 21st century context on just how much money Edmund found in that cave, figuring out Monte Cristo's wealth translated to dollars and then adjusted to inflation is tricky, but it's somewhere between $500 million and $1.2 billion, depending on how you account for it. In 2018 dollars, he essentially asked Danglars for $72 million of just walking around money for that 1 year in Paris. Anyway, it's really good to get back into the story, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Thanks again to KiwiCo for sponsoring us today. They create super cool, hands-on projects for kids that make learning about science, technology, engineering, art, and even math fun. It's amazing. From building their own arcade games, to constructing a hydraulic claw, or tinkering with electronics and motors, KiwiCo makes awesome stuff for kids. KiwiCo is offering Fictional listeners the chance to try them for free. That's right, free. To redeem this offer and learn more about their projects for kids, visit kiwico.com/fictional. That's KiwiCo, KIWICO.com/fictional. Today's episode, of course, was adapted from The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. It was written by me, Jason Weiser, and edited by Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by Breakmaster Cylinder, and there are links to even more music in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.